2024. You're right, we're starting out strong for the 2024 with artist Grace Freeman. So we'll intro Grace here in just a second, but if you all can indulge me and make certain that your phone is silenced.
Oh, wait, I should do that too. Thank you. Good idea. There we go. Before it rings in the Star Trek theme.
Proud thing. So again, welcome to Ketchikan Museums. We're really thrilled that you all are joining us here, especially on a sunny, not overcast rainy day. So we do appreciate you all being here. We were thrilled to have Grace here with us because of her work that kind of ties into this exhibit. And because for the last year, we've had coloring sheets there on the table, and people have asked us, how do I pick the color of the dinosaur? What am I doing? How do I color this? You know, from little wee kids all the way up to adults. So finally we get some answers.
Yes, yeah. We'll talk a little bit about my dinosaur choices.
So we will kind of let Grace introduce herself a little bit here. But Grace was born here and raised here in Ketchikan. And you've been creating art ever since you could hold a crayon, and of course the medium has changed.
Yes.
But we'll let you explore and share a little bit more about your training and your approach to art, and of course, you know, this adventure in color that you're taking us there. So we'll have time for questions later, but let's go ahead and introduce Grace Freeman.
Thank you. Thank you everybody for coming today, and thank you for inviting me to do this. It's really fun to get to be able to talk about my artwork and to talk about the coloring that I do, since a lot of it ends up being kind of in a little computer cave all by myself, and then I come out and show it to the world. So I was born and raised here in Ketchikan. I haven't really had any formal training in any of the artwork I've done. I've taken a lot of classes and a lot of things here and there whenever I could, and I took one Photoshop class from Greg Poppin way back in the day, but that was all about photography, and so most of the stuff I've done is all just trial and error and figuring out how to use the program and trying out a button and trying out a thing. And the nice thing about digital art is there's an undo button for pretty much anything, which is why it gets hard for me to sort of do traditional art sometimes, because I want to undo that last line that wasn't perfect. But so the nice thing about it is you can just kind of try anything and try a new line or a new color or a new shape or a new idea or a new hand or a new face, and you can just go back to the old designs or go forward if it works out well. So for some of my artwork, I don't know how I choose which ones, but I will do screenshots along the way of the progress. And so I dug into my archives and found a few of them that I thought would be good to share, to kind of follow along from the start to the finish, and at each stage what I kind of focus on and what techniques I use. And so I figured I'd start with this one that I used for the promo pictures, which has some of Ray's dinosaurs around the outside, but the original artwork that it was from is this one, which I did just this last summer, and it was a failed Blueberry Festival submission. But I was glad that it failed, because it gave me a chance to give it a new life beyond what I submitted for the Blueberry Festival. And so before I get to this point, I usually start out with sketches. Lately I've been doing a lot more traditional medium sketches as opposed to digital sketches, because it has a little bit more room for those happy accidents where lines don't quite go how you think you want them to, or shapes show up that I didn't plan for but just look really cool. So for this one, I did a bunch of face sketches to kind of try and find the face that I was looking for, try to get the expression or just the colors and the shapes that I was thinking about doing, waiting for something to jump out at me. And usually at the same time that I'm doing all those initial sketches, I'm also doing way too much Google research, where I just pick something of a first topic. Like for this one, I knew I wanted it to look like kind of old Greek pottery. So I started looking at that, and just from one photo, if I like something, you can click on it and it'll show you similar images to that. And I just sort of scroll through and wait for things to jump out at me that's what I kind of have bubbling in the back of my brain. And I had this idea, I don't know, a year or two ago. I saw somebody who did a Medusa drawing where the snakes were very short and stubby, and I instantly thought, what if you had slug Medusa hair? And so I let that just sort of sit in the back of my brain and kind of that file of ideas. And so when it came around for Blueberry Festival this year, I thought, well, that would be a perfect time to make myself do this idea that I've had and to finish it by the deadline for the submission. And even if it didn't win, or if it did, that would be amazing. But if it didn't, this was kind of a way to make myself do that idea and to finish the artwork. So this is a variety of kind of my huge folder of ideas, which some of them go nowhere and some of them do work out, which of sort of sketch or statues and slugs and pottery, and the initial sketch that I did for the pose, which you can see a couple in the center there, references I did for the arms or the clothing folds. And the first thing I focus on for pretty much anything is the overall shapes of it. It's not really about the lines or the colors. I'm generally pretty good at colors. I've always been kind of, I don't know, somehow good at picking good colors. So I don't really focus on that when I start. It's all about the silhouette and the shape and having very strong layout. And then I go in and work on the colors. So at this point, I've decided that this was the face that I liked the most for this one. I like the direct forward facing and I like the shadows. And I put it into my pose sketch. But I couldn't quite make the braid work for the slug hair. It just wasn't working, so I gave her more curly hair so that I could have the slugs, especially to be able to bring the focus up by the face, whereas before it would have been traveling down the body. And it kind of skipped, I didn't have the progress shots between that one and this one, but here I'm really focusing on the shapes and the layout. And at this point the colors are almost secondary. This one was pretty close to what the final colors are, but sometimes I just plop in any color. Sometimes it's neon colors, sometimes it's yellows and blues and just anything, because I'm really focused on the shapes and the silhouettes. And one of the nice things about Photoshop is that you can, once you dial in the colors themselves, you can lock them off and edit them. So I'll really focus on getting the shapes of the lines that I like and the silhouette and the block colors first before I even think about the colors that they're going to be in the final artwork. And this close-up kind of shows you how I go about most of my line work, which isn't actually drawing the lines themselves, it's drawing the shapes in and around the lines. And I started doing that technique, I don't know how long ago. I took an intro to relief printing class, and I realized I could plan out the relief printing on my computer by filling a canvas with black and drawing the white lines. And I decided I really liked doing the line art that way. And it sort of has grown since then. And there's something for me about defining the shapes around it that gives those lines a lot more character and a lot more flow than just drawing the line itself. It almost becomes kind of organic and wobbly in a way, and looks at the lines in just a slightly different way, that even if it isn't obvious in the final artwork, that's usually how I'm working on my line work. And this one, it's a little more obvious because you can see the color shapes, because I use that tan as the background. But on some of them, it will be a dark background. And so talk a little bit before I get to the color choices. Usually when I'm choosing the colors, I don't think as much about the individual colors themselves. I'm usually focused on, as I started laying it out, where I want the eye to go and where I want the highest contrast to go or the lowest contrast to be. And that's usually how I pick all the colors as I go through my artwork. So sometimes the color, there's kind of a base color or a set color that I start out with, or something that it has to be. So in this, like in the previous one, I knew I wanted yellow slug hair. So as I'm choosing the colors, I'll be thinking about, okay, that yellow is set because I want it to be yellow. So where do I want it to be around that? What colors do I want to pop out? What colors do I want to emphasize that? And here you can see kind of examples of that. So there's each color, which we think of, like red or blue or green or all that, kind of has 3 elements to it. It has the hue, which is what the red or the orange or that kind of stuff. But it also has the saturation, which is how intense the pigment is or how bold it is. And then if it gets less saturated, it gets more gray. And then there's also the brightness or value, which is how light or dark it is. And the brightness or value usually ends up being the more important thing in any artwork, and that will draw the eye no matter what, like the whitest white and the blackest black. So as I'm laying out all the colors and choosing them, I really do choose them depending on what I want the layout of the artwork to be, where I want it to be busy, where I want things to kind of blend in and be kind of calm. And those are the 3 elements as I'm choosing them that I think about. And because you can have a green that's green, but it can really vary within that green. So choosing the individual kinds of green or the individual kinds of blue or red, I really think about where I want the highest contrast to be and where I want it to kind of blend in. And so in that sort of mindset, I knew I wanted the face to be the most focused, so I put a really strong contrast of just that bright red on her lips. And this one is a little unusual because I have so much black in the artwork, but usually I'll only do the really white whites and the really black blacks in the eyes and on the face, because we're so used to looking at faces as being the focus. I usually want that to be the focus of the artwork. And then the blueberries themselves, I wanted to kind of be the next area of focus. So they're kind of the brightest, and that red and that blue next to each other pop out. And when I was choosing the shirt colors, I wanted it to kind of blend in with the whole shape of all the clothes. So I went with the yellow that picks up that little bit of yellow from the slugs, but it also blends in with that whole shape and makes a very solid shape for her body. So this is the final thing that I submitted for the Blueberry Festival, and it was not chosen. So I decided to go back to square one and take out all the text. And the nice thing about Photoshop and digital artwork in general, as I'd mentioned before, is that all the pieces, you can kind of rearrange them. And I usually have them on different layers, anything that I don't want to interact with each other. For me, I've always thought of it as kind of pieces of impossibly thin plastic or glass that are all layered on top of each other. And each one of them has kind of an element of the painting, and then they all layer up to make the final picture. But you can separate them out and work on any of those layers that you want within that kind of flattened piece of artwork. So on this one, the clothes are on a separate layer, the hair is on a separate layer, the slugs are on a separate layer. Anything that I want to be able to work on just that and not have it interact with the other elements. So I was able to scoot her over and fill in the blacks and take away the text. And I didn't have the time for the original piece to be able to do anything other than flat colors, because I had lots of other things going on, and this was kind of a fun extra thing that I was working on. So I was really excited actually to be able to go in and finish off the artwork how I kind of imagined I might be able to, but didn't have the time. And so I started with adding shading and highlighting to the skin. And the nice thing about digital artwork as well, and most programs will do this, is it will let you lock off the layers, so that once I have those strong shapes and that strong silhouette and that strong, like the skin in here in particular, I can work within that and it will stay exactly the same. So even if my brush goes up to the edge of her arm, with something really soft, it won't go outside of that shape that I already created. So the shapes are locked in, and then I kind of work within the shapes. It's kind of, there's traditional media variations like using masking fluid for watercolors, or if you're doing airbrushing, you'd mask off the areas that you don't want to airbrush in. It's sort of a version of that where you can work kind of softly and messily within the shape, but the shapes are set in stone. so you can't go outside them, so it still maintains those soft, or those strong shapes. And for the final piece, one of the nice things about digital artwork, which lets you try a lot of things, is I was able to try out different backgrounds, but in the vein of those color choices, I didn't like having that green in the background. I thought it took away from all the colors in the middle. So I went for a more monochrome background with some details that kind of blended in just that little bit. And this is the final artwork for that one. And for her hair, I was able to add some highlights and shadows to that too. And I referenced photos of light coming through skunk cabbage for the color choices for that one. So a lot of times I will, especially if I want to use something real or something organic for a reference for color, I'll pull up photos that I have around here, even if it isn't obvious that those are the colors I'm choosing. I'll choose colors from sunset here, or light in the trees, or this case, some light through some skunk cabbage. Just colors that I see around that I like to sort of tuck away and be able to pull back out for future artwork. And so this piece was completely digital, but when I asked people what of my artwork they might want to see the process of or hear more about, this was one of the pieces that I got the most response from. And in fact, somebody in the audience today is wearing a screen printed version of the moths on the side there. And so this piece is very mixed media. It ended up being a original one-of-a-kind drawing at the end, but I did start out planning it digitally. And so the first process of it is really similar to what I did for the previous one, which I started calling her Slugdusa, the previous one, but the official artsy title is Summer Blueberry Daze. But she's still Slugdusa in all my file folders. So on this one, even though it was a different medium and it was going to be a different outcome, I started out with some sketches, and I've been really liking watercolor pencils for sketches lately, because you can draw the lines, but then once the water goes on there, it kind of does whatever it's going to do, and it ends up creating some shapes and some gradients and things that I wasn't really expecting, and I like finding those happy accidents and those shapes that I wasn't really planning for to use for the future artwork. So these were the two sketches that I did for that. I don't remember where I came up with the idea for that kind of floppy shirt top thing. But I did like the idea that if you folded it flat, it kind of looks like a moth's wings, and then it's folded over. And she, for, I don't know, one day, started out being the queen of moths, which is why she has kind of a crown in one of the sketches. But as soon as I started diving into the image research and the Google image searches, I got way too into knights and armor, and so she became quickly the knight of moths. And so here's some of the various references that I used as I planned out the layout of the pose. A few faces, some clothing folds, some knight's armor, and you can see here, this one is, I couldn't quite get the logic to work of that top, so I cut it out in paper and taped it to a little model and took a photo of it to get the shapes right. And so sometimes I will do that. I'll make a real life model of something, or particularly for clothing folds or odd shapes, just to be able to get the shapes and the shading right, because I knew eventually I'd be doing the shading on that, and I'd want to be able to have those shadows to work out like they actually would in the real world. And so once I had my layout and the pose kind of dialed in, I started working on the lines for this one. And this one shows a little bit more that, if you look at the details on it, how the page started out as one blue block. And so what I'm actually doing is erasing away around the lines. And you can see kind of little chunks that are still left there. I'll leave some of those sometimes because I think it gives more an organic feel to it. So any of the line work here is actually just what's left of the blue as I take away all of the white areas. And it's laid on top of a paper texture that I scanned myself and created a fill texture of. And so the next stage, once I had the lines dialed in, and I really liked all those line thicknesses, was to lay out where I wanted the text to go. And I already had the moth design of the 3 moths going down the side. And I wanted to, even though they weren't going to be included in what I was going to print of the digital design, I wanted to know where they were going to go and wanted to plan out that part of the design. So that's just kind of a temporary that's in there right now. And on the sides, I picked out a font that I liked and laid out the way I wanted the font to go. And this is more working towards getting the layout how I want it to be, because I knew I was going to print it out on paper and do all the final details with colored pencil and paint. So this was the next phase, was doing all the shading on it. And because I knew I wanted to do the colored pencils for all the highlights, this is all my shadows. So this is more looking at the darkest colors and just blocking out the colors, the same thing as before, those strong shapes, looking at what shapes things are and the silhouette almost more than any of the color choices. And once I had it laid out that way, this is the version that I gave to our local printer, Terry Piles, who printed it out for me. And this is the starting phase for all the traditional media that I did on top, for the painting, for the colored pencil, for all the detailing. This is kind of that under layer. And this, at this phase, as I'm doing the colored pencils and all the detailing on that, and it's hard to see in the scan of it, but the sides with the text are metallic paint. So that kind of, from before, that really light guide that I gave myself was there to help me get all the text straight and keep it all even. And then I used that to add the metallic paint. And at this point, I knew it wasn't done, but I started having a panic about messing it up. So kind of like doing a Jenga tower, there's that point where it starts to get unstable and you have to choose it correctly. That's kind of the feeling that I have when I get to that. It's not done, but I do really like where it's going and I don't want to ruin it. So at that point, I thought it would be a good time to scan it in. And I did a couple test prints of just this printed out on paper so that I could play around with colors, particularly for the leaves in the background, because I didn't want them to become too busy and too messy. And to also be able to do the screen print testing on not the original artwork. So I could get it wrong if I needed to, or get it askew and just figure out how to line it up. So I have a couple, I forgot to bring them in today, but I have a couple test prints that look just like this with scribbles and color choices and playing around on them. And there's prints on the back and prints on the front. And I just sort of wanted to make sure that I knew what the final details were going to look like before I put them into the artwork. And one of the things I also did at this point was I felt like the values and that contrast that I was talking about before wasn't quite working how I wanted it to. So in Photoshop, one of the nice things you can do is put it in black and white and see what the values are in just black and white. So once it switches from the color version to black and white, I sort of saw that there was too much brightness from the gloves and her face was kind of fading into the background just a little bit. So I knew I needed to work on those values as I finished it. And then the finished piece with the detailing on the leaves and the screen printing has more of a cohesive look to it, and all the different elements are kind of coming together the way I'd wanted them to, where the most focus is on her face, which has that little pop of purple, and a lot of the high contrast and bright colors are on her face as well. And the whitest white is that moon halo around her, which is kind of referenced from the way classical paintings would put a gold halo around any characters or holy figures. This is kind of a moon halo that referenced that as well. And then that process being pretty similar from this digital or this mixed media piece as opposed to the digital piece I actually use a pretty similar thought process when I do my coloring for other people. And before I started doing coloring for Ray, I was doing a lot of coloring for kind of independent and small comic book artists. A lot of them were wanting to submit their artwork to get picked up by a publisher, and they wanted to see it in full color, or they wanted to do a small independently published run of prints. And so this is kind of the kind of stuff that I was doing before I got connected with Ray. Just kind of straightforward comic book art, which is really fun to do and very cinematic, because I enjoy movies and cinematography and the lighting and that kind of stuff. So it was enjoyable, but it was very, I don't know, not bland in a way, but it was a job. And I would do it, and I would, kind of clock in and clock out. And the different people were different types of, fun to work with, and they had different ideas. And then I got connected with Ray Troll by our mutual friend Mark Osborne, who told him that somebody in town did digital coloring and that he needed some coloring for that. And so I switched from this kind of thing to this kind of thing. And so this is the first thing I ever colored for Ray, which is at the time was a saber-tooth salmon, but now I know is a spike-tooth salmon. And this, for all the spike-tooth aficionados out there, I know this is not the right tooth anymore. It has changed, and we have done cosmetic surgery on it. But this was the original drawing that I did, or original coloring I did from Ray's drawing. And probably the most complex thing that I've ever colored of Ray's, which is in the exhibit, is the fossil map. And I went back, because people have asked me, and I had no idea what my total time was for it. So I went back and found my invoices for the invoice time, and it was 48 hours total worth of coloring, which if you split it into days and is quite a long time. So even though this is completely different from my own artwork, it's a very similar process for when I color it. So Ray makes, of course, all the design choices for where everything's laid out and what shapes there are. And this is how it started out. This is the file I got. And you can see the little seam down the middle, because it was such a big drawing that I also had to do the surgery of combining the two scans. But even when it's something like this, which is completely different from things that I would do myself, the first thing I focus on is locking in the shapes and the main sort of silhouettes and the main outlines and anything in particular that needs to be a certain color. So choosing that color for the ocean, and since this was similar to maps that Ray had done before, I knew it needed to be that yellow for the Alaska and that sort of yellow for all the signs. So choosing those colors that have to be a specific color, and then working around that with how they're going to interact with those set colors is how I started out with it. And it was pretty overwhelming to figure out where to start with all the little animals and creatures and cheeseburgers and fossils. But I kind of came up with this method of doing groups of specific kinds of creatures all in one go. So I started out like here, you can see I've done all of the elephant-like creatures and all your pinnipeds, your sea lions and your seals and your walruses, and just sort of grouping them together that way kind of allowed me to chip away at the full piece. And it also allowed me for each one to make color choices that were similar but different within each group of animals or creatures, so that they had a kind of cohesive feel but didn't feel like they were choosing the exact same colors for each one. And I just kept chipping away at it and adding more and more in. And one of the last things I did on this one was the dinosaurs, actually, because they had a little more freedom to choose what colors, so I could use what I'd been learning and been using for all the other ones to make similar but different color choices. Like generally animals will have a different colored belly than their back, or they'll have different colored head than their body, or slightly different colored legs than the rest of them. So using that kind of same organic logic for all of the different dinosaurs and referencing real animals, for lizards, or for birds actually, for the dinosaurs is a good way to go, just to make them feel like they're a real lived-in creature and have that variety within their color scheme as opposed to being one block of color. And a few of the other pieces that I colored in the exhibit are the Surfing Desmos and the Terrane wreck. And that similar process for all of these of blocking in the colors and really focusing on where do you want the eye to look when somebody looks at it, and what elements do I want to blend in and what elements to stand out. And for the Terrane wreck, I actually went and referenced Victorian color schemes that they would use in houses and clothes, because it was kind of a Victorian train, and just kind of putting those little details in there that aren't really part of the final piece, but I think help lend a cohesive element to it to reference from actual artwork or actual historical elements or actual animals, to bring it to that surreal level, but to have that basis of the real world. And that's kind of all I have. Oh, and I also forgot that one, I missed that one when I was doing it. It's right back there. So that one, I don't have an image of it here, because when I was coming in looking what was in the exhibit, I didn't catch that one. But that one, to North America, was it the exit the horror, exit, what is it, Ray?
Enter the bison, exit the horse.
Enter the bison, exit the horse. Because it has so many animals in it that are moving around, that idea of where to move the eye and where to have little points of highlights and colors to kind of travel around and keep that flow going, is that idea of contrast and where to move the flow of the artwork with the color. And that's the end of my images.
Wow.
And thank you. And I'm happy to take any questions that I didn't get to, or ideas that I explained in a very confusing way that makes sense to me and no one else. So anybody have questions? Yes, Ray.
I had one.
Yes.
When you were doing your line work, you said that you were you actually using an eraser tool to get down?
Well,
One thing,
it all works kind of the same way. Here, I'll pull up the image to talk about while we're doing it. So I'm actually, there isn't, it's kind of like erasing, but it really is, I add a layer mask. We'll get technical for any actual Photoshop people on it. Is I put a fill layer of just one block color, and then I add a layer mask where it's black and white. So you're just working in black and white, and it's affecting the color block itself. So there isn't any, well, you can do gradients, and if you have a soft brush, it does end up that way. But I'm actually painting with white, but because it's Photoshop and you can layer things and overlap them and make it kind of transparent, I'm painting with white, but the white doesn't show up because it's transparent over top of the texture. So I actually go in and paint with white around all the dark lines. But with the kind of Photoshop magic, you can make that white go away. So it's painting in black and white. So if it was it's sort of like if it was a block print and I was carving it away, it's doing all the kind of carving. And then the color itself, it could be any color. Here I've chosen blue, but I could have chosen any color to be that kind of line color, that raised color that still exists that wasn't taken away. So it's subtracting, but it's kind of subtracting with the values in the kind of behind the scenes Photoshop magic, but it ends up being the same effect of erasing or carving away or taking away. And the nice thing about Photoshop is you can actually add it back. So if I carve away too much, I can add back some content and then carve away again. It still gets that kind of organic look to it. But I can make the mistakes or decide that I need to change something. I could have changed her hair and gave her a whole hairstyle and carved that as well. So when I add things back on, I'll usually just add a big blob and then carve back away from it instead of focusing on getting that line of the new thing. I'll just add a big blob of something. Like if I change the hand, I would just cover the whole area with black and then carve back around it. Does that help at all?
Grace,
Oh, yes.
this is a totally self-serving
Oh, go for it.
Because we've been admiring the moth
Yes, yeah.
here in the room. Where can we find your artwork? Where can we get your apparel?
Oh,
Where can we
yes.
follow the process?
The gracemakesart.com will give you links to all the places that you can get my stuff and all the things that I have. I have an Etsy shop, but it doesn't have much on it right now. I did have stuff at the Soho Coho, which is now been retired and is transforming into Star Gallery. So I'll have stuff at Yvonne Zervitz's new Star Gallery in the spring when that has fully emerged from the winter. And yeah, so I've got stuff online, and then I usually do booths at Blueberry Festival and Winter Arts Fair and things like that to kind of make all my fun little stuff and bring it to people in person. Yes, Marnie.
Photoshop question. I
Yes.
just know
Oh, yeah.
Basics.
Yeah.
So something as large and complex as the Alaska map,
Mm-hmm.
like all those individual different pieces,
Mm-hmm.
are there like all those layers for each of those colors for each of those things? So I'm picturing like.
Yeah, sometimes I'm a lot more organized when I'm doing something for someone else than for myself, because for my own artwork, I will try all those things and then just leave them and not delete the layers. And I don't label my own things very well for the layers, but for other people I will. So when I'm coloring something for other people, I usually have a clear image of where I want to end up. So for the fossil map, all the creatures were on one layer because none of them were touching each other. They were pretty separate. And so I knew even if I was kind of messy about the painting within that, it wasn't going to bleed over into the different creatures. But for the other elements, like the ocean was on one layer, the Alaska color was on one layer, all the little signs and labels were on one layer. Just basically anything that I don't want to interact and that I want to be able to edit or tweak later separately, I'll put it on a different layer. Any other question? Yes, Joanna.
To make sure you got the rest of your plugs in.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. Did I miss?
Trollart.com.
Oh, yes. Yeah, on Trollart.com I do
And
have.
then you usually do the Blueberry Arts and Winter Arts.
Yes, yeah. That's usually where you can find me in person, is at those events.
I have one more question.
Yes.
Do you? I was thinking, especially with the multimedia pieces, but do you have? Is it easy to know when a piece is done, or do you struggle with that?
I tend to, especially with my own artwork, I'll come back to it in different phases so I can walk away from it and come back and look at it not really focused and lost in the middle of it. For coloring for other people, it's a little more straightforward about when it's done, especially if I give it to the artist that I'm coloring for and they ask for changes or say looks great. Sometimes I think, I don't know if it's done, but I'll see if they think it's done, and then I'll get the feedback from that. So that one's a little more easier because there's kind of a team, either me and one other person or other people that are involved in a bigger project that kind of give feedback and decide when it's done. But for my own artwork, especially before I call it done, I will leave it alone and do something else for a while and come back and see if I still feel like it's missing something or if any more of it is just adding too much to it. Yes?
Coming back to the map. The map is large, and are you working on it at full?
Yeah, in
size?
fact, the map, the computer I had at the time couldn't quite handle that map as huge as I wanted it to be, so I did have to scale it down, not beyond the actual size of the map, but I couldn't be really, really zoomed in on it just because with all those layers and all that size, it just couldn't quite do it. I do have a new computer now, which handled a giant mural that I collaborated with that was at the Seattle Aquarium, and it handled that like a champ. So I think now I could have done that Alaska map at a huge print size, like, you know, that would have been full resolution on a huge wall. But I did have to scale it back a little bit so that I wasn't now for a huge thing, I can push, it handles it fine while I'm working on it, and then I push save and I go get a snack and come back. The old one, I would have been push save and then come back the next day, that kind of thing. So
That was my other question. What is your work setup?
I just have a desk in the corner there, kind of jammed all in my little office desk work area. But the nice thing about the digital art and why I do a lot of digital art is it fits all in the computer. There isn't piles of things. It's all, if you organize where you put the file in the first place, when you close it, it's always still there. It always snaps back to whatever folder you're in. So it lets me just have a whole bunch of things and kind of a whole mess going on, but being able to find it easily because that's where it was put in the first place, so it always is there.
I totally
Yes.
have an aquarium question.
Yes.
So it's fantastic. It's like 65 feet long and 10 feet tall?
It's like 11, well, two of them are there. One of them is a adaptation of Ray's, a few pieces of Ray's, and one of them is Marvin Oliver and Ray Troll combined. And that one I just did the design kind of arrangement work on. And one, I think it's, I want to say 11 feet tall at one end and 9 at the other end. It's a weird shape as it curves around the aquarium. It's over by the seals and sea lions.
There's like a Grace Freeman Easter egg in there, right?
Oh yeah, yes. I did add a mermaid of my own in there. And my signature's on the corner, but. Oh yes, yeah, I did add a seal because there was a request to have a seal. Yes, yeah, that's why. But the mermaid was probably the thing in there that wasn't a request to add. It was something that I just snuck in there. Yes.
Are you going to be doing any more classes with the Main Street Art Gallery? Something with comic book coloring, even though it's your favorite?
Well, it's not that it's not my favorite. It's just, it's something that just I did kind of as a job and I enjoyed. But that would be something that would be good to do. I didn't have any plans right now, but I have had some people asking for basic Photoshop classes and some basic art, using art and Photoshop and just that kind of stuff. So a lot of comic book coloring these days is digital, so that would be kind of a cool thing to do, as well as it might work out as part of a bigger class to be able to choose your own project or choose something to bring in that was your own to use to test out and use the kind of ideas on some comic book stuff. Any other questions?
Do you do live portrait? Do you like to draw from live models or mostly?
Well, there's not a lot of chances to do live model drawing here. So it's just this last fall, Dave Rubin and the Arts Council put together some life drawing sessions that they were doing all month, and I went to every one of those I could because it's just such a different experience of drawing a three-dimensional model in front of you as opposed to a flat piece of paper or a flat thing on the screen, which the flat images on the screen are actually really good at kind of condensing down the 3D so it's easier to understand as shapes, but it also is just different than what we see in the real world. So.
Well, I think the last question to head us out here, what are we looking to, what's upcoming? You showed us, Night of Moths, what can we?
Oh yeah, I don't have anything particularly upcoming right now. I've got a lot of ideas and projects bubbling away in the background, nothing really to announce. But I am always working on something. One of the things that's been really good for me as an artist is to, even if I don't have a job to do that day, is to do it as a job and clock in at a certain point and just stay busy. So if I don't have a project, I'll sketch, I'll draw something for fun, I'll draw some characters from a TV show I've been watching or a movie I saw, just to kind of stay working at it. And that's been really important in the last 5 years or so to just progress my artwork forward and just always be doing something.
I have a
Right?
big question.
Oh, okay. Put me on the
Your
spot.
art, I just wonder if you had any comments or thoughts about the Ketchikan art community growing up here.
Oh yeah, I don't think I would be doing as much artwork as I did if there wasn't just so much around me all the time. So the community here is really supportive, and there's everybody seems to do something. Everybody is a quilter or a painter or a photographer or something like that. There's just so many artists here that it's just sort of always been something that everybody just seems to be. And everybody's been so supportive of me doing my artwork in general, like putting it out there. And the internet isn't always so nice about artwork, but everybody here has just been so nice about I mean, when I was a little kid and I would put artwork, I would get so much good feedback, and it was just so nice from our whole artistic community of art appreciators as well as artists themselves. Like, there's so many people that are just hungry for art and they want to find it out there, and they're really encouraging for especially seeing new stuff, I think. Yes?
So now you can do some wearable art.
Yeah, I could. I do want to do, I've had an idea for a wearable art thing, which the themes are always so a little amorphous that you could jam something else into. So someday when I have enough room to make a giant mess to make a wearable art project, I do want to do something. But
do you live full-time in Ketchikan?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I was born and raised here. I do like to travel and get out a little bit. Otherwise, I think I would go. Same thing with being in my little art cave. It isn't as good to be always on the rock all the time. I got to get out there and do something else and see other stuff and travel all over if I can.
Well, we won't let Grace escape the museum, but we will come to an end of the program here, so feel free to ask Grace questions and take a look at that giant Alaska map.
Yes.
That Crusin the Fossil Coastline exhibit. So again, thank you, Grace Freeman.
Thank you.